By the scorching summer of 1854, the slave auction house on Commerce Street in Montgomery, Alabama, had become a kind of theater where cruelty dressed itself in business language and men competed not just for labor, but for trophies they could show off to their neighbors. The auction platform stood in the center of a wide dirt yard, ringed by covered benches where planters sat fanning themselves with folded newspapers, their boots scuffing red clay dust into the air every time they shifted for a better view. Behind them, a row of storefronts leaned shoulder to shoulder, their windows crowded with faces, merchants keeping one eye on their goods and another on the sales, free black workers who came to witness what they'd narrowly escaped, and occasionally the wives of buyers who pretended they weren't watching while their eyes tracked every humiliating detail. The air was thick with the smell of horses, tobacco spit, unwashed bodies, and the particular sourness that clung to places where fear gathered in large quantities. On the platform itself, a heavy-set auctioneer named Covington worked through his inventory with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd long ago stopped thinking of what he sold as anything more complicated than furniture, calling out ages and skills and starting prices in the same flat tone he might use to describe a plow or a wagon. If stories about a slave auction where beauty becomes a weapon, where a young woman's face makes white men fight to own her, while she quietly uses that very attention to engineer her own escape, where hidden documents and scars that form secret letters turn a sale into the first move of a chess game no one else knows is being played, speak to you, if the idea that enslaved women developed tactics we'd now call espionage, that resistance wore the mask of compliance until the perfect moment to strike, that freedom could be won with folded papers and strategic patience as much as with midnight runs and gunfire, then like this video right now, subscribe so the algorithm doesn't bury the histories they tried to erase, and comment what country or city you're watching from. Because these tactics of turning beauty into leverage and documents into weapons traveled far beyond Alabama's red clay, and the lessons still matter. By midday, Covington had moved through 24 people, field hands with scarred backs, a blacksmith whose limp dropped his price by half, a cook sold because her previous owner drank himself into bankruptcy, a pair of adolescent boys auctioned together because splitting them would have required more paperwork than anyone wanted to deal with. The crowd's energy rose and fell in waves, sharpening when someone young or skilled stepped up, dulling back into bored murmurs when the only thing on offer was desperation sold cheap. Then, just as the heat began to make even the most determined buyers think about leaving for somewhere cooler, Covington paused, grinned in a way that said he'd been saving something special, and gestured toward the holding pen behind the platform. A moment later, a young woman was brought forward, and the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. She was perhaps 19, though the way she carried herself made guessing difficult, too composed for a teenager, too smooth-skinned to be much older. Her complexion was a warm, luminous brown that made men think of expensive things like polished mahogany or amber held up to lamplight, and her features had the kind of delicate symmetry that came from mixed ancestry. Everyone understood, but no one was supposed to mention aloud. High cheekbones, a straight nose with just enough curve to mark what had been blended into her bloodline, full lips that needed no cosmetics, and large dark eyes framed by lashes that caught the afternoon sun. Her hair, thick and tightly coiled, had been smoothed and pinned into an elaborate style that bared the long, graceful line of her neck. She wore a simple dress of pale muslin that had been carefully altered to emphasize her figure without crossing into indecency, and around her throat hung a string of cheap glass beads that glittered just enough to make her look like something precious, wrapped in false modesty. Everything about her presentation screamed deliberate staging, the kind that happened when a trader knew he had something rare and wanted to extract every possible dollar from men whose wallets opened wider when their fantasies were involved. On the auction board beside the platform, her listing had been written in unusually careful script, as if even the handwriting were trying to add value. Lot 17, female, approx. 19 years, trained domestic servant, literate in English, exceptional carriage and appearance, sound in all respects, never bred. The clinical phrasing was designed to communicate desirability without admitting lust, but everyone in that yard understood what exceptional appearance really meant. The men leaning forward weren't imagining her scrubbing floors or serving tea. In the back of the crowd, a small cluster of enslaved people who'd been brought along to mind their owners' horses watched her too, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes alive with something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps, or dread, or the bitter knowledge that beauty under slavery was as much curse as currency. The young woman, whose name on the paper tag tied to her wrist read simply Eliza House, stood at the center of the platform and did exactly what she'd been trained since childhood to do. She made herself still, not frozen in terror, not stiff with defiance, but composed in a way that suggested both obedience and an unshakable inner calm, a balance that white people found endlessly fascinating because it allowed them to project refinement onto her without having to grant her humanity. Her gaze moved slowly across the crowd, never locking onto any one face long enough to seem challenging, never dropping so low as to seem broken. It was a performance she'd practiced 1,000 times in front of mistresses and mirrors, the art of being seen without being readable, of offering a surface so smooth that no one thought to look for the calculations happening underneath. Covington let the silence stretch until anticipation turned uncomfortable, then spread his arms wide like a carnival barker. "Gentlemen," he boomed, his voice cutting through the yard's hum, "I know you've been patient this morning, and I always reward patience. This here is the finest article I've had the privilege to offer all season. Raised in a quality household from the age of 8, trained in every domestic duty you can name. Sewing, cooking, serving table, managing children, keeping accounts. She reads and writes a better hand than half the white boys in this town, and she's never needed the lash because she's never given cause for it. No scars, no children, no bad habits. Examine her yourselves if you doubt me, but I'll wager my commission you won't find finer quality between here and Charleston." A planter in the second row, sun-dark and thick-shouldered, raised his hand without waiting for prompting. "Let's see her teeth," he called out, the same tone he'd use ordering an inspection of a horse. Covington gestured to Eliza. "Open up, girl," he said, not cruelly, but with the unthinking authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to give such orders. Eliza parted her lips and tilted her head slightly, so the nearest men could see that her teeth were straight, white, intact, proof of good health, good genetics, good value for money in a system that measured human worth in molars and muscle tone. Approving murmurs rippled through the benches. She held the position until Covington waved for her to close her mouth again, and through the entire inspection, her eyes stayed focused on some invisible point in the middle distance, as if her mind had stepped out of her body temporarily and was waiting patiently for permission to return. The bidding opened fast and climbed faster than anything Covington had seen all month. A tobacco planter from the hill country started with a number high enough to make several men whistle under their breath. A cotton factor from Mobile, narrow-eyed and slick-suited, raised him immediately. A sugar planter from down near the Gulf Coast, whose reputation for cruelty traveled ahead of him like smoke, joined in with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never been outbid for anything he wanted. The numbers leapt upward in increments that would have bought whole families at slower auctions, but this wasn't about needing a cook or a nursemaid anymore. It was about pride, about status, about owning something so rare that other men would envy you for it. Eliza stood through it all with her hands folded loosely in front of her, breathing slow and controlled, her face a mask of careful neutrality. Inside, though, every nerve was crackling with awareness. She'd been counting on this, on the way her appearance would turn a simple transaction into a contest of egos, on the way men's pride would push them past reason and drive the price so high that whoever finally bought her would have made an investment too significant to waste carelessly. Her mother had told her once, years ago in a whisper that still echoed, that beauty under slavery was a double-edged coin. One side bought you violation and danger, the other bought you visibility and leverage, and if you were smart enough and lucky enough, you could sometimes flip that coin in your favor. The trick was surviving long enough to make the flip count. As the bids climbed past $1,200, a sum that would have seemed absurd for house labor in any rational market, the crowd's energy sharpened into something almost predatory. Men who'd planned to spend their money on land or equipment were reconsidering their budgets. Others, already priced out, leaned back with sour expressions and began constructing the stories they'd tell later about how she wasn't worth half that anyway. Eliza tracked it all peripherally, while her real attention focused on 3 men whose bids had outlasted everyone else's. The sugar planter had eyes that moved over her like hands, already imagining ownership in ways that made her skin crawl. The tobacco man was rougher, his interest more about proving he'd arrived socially than about what he'd actually do with her. But the third bidder, a man sitting slightly apart from the main crowd in a dark coat and an expression of controlled calculation, felt different. He bid sparingly, only when it looked like he might lose, and when he did, he used small nods instead of shouts. His posture was too erect, his face too carefully neutral, and something in the way his eyes moved suggested he was weighing factors the others hadn't even considered. When Covington's gavel finally fell at $1,250, sold to the quiet man in the back, Eliza exhaled carefully and let her shoulders drop just a fraction. Around the yard, men muttered in amazement or resentment, a few laughing at the absurdity of the price. Covington gestured for her to step down, and she did, moving on legs that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to show weakness. The man who'd bought her approached with measured steps. Up close he smelled of bay rum and ink rather than field dust, and when he offered his hand to steady her descent from the platform, his palm was uncalloused but firm. He didn't smile, didn't leer, didn't do anything but meet her eyes for one brief, evaluating second before turning toward the clerk's table to settle accounts. "Come," he said quietly. "We'll finish the paperwork and leave before the crowd gets worse." An older black woman who'd been sitting behind him during the auction joined them as they walked. She moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent decades being ignored, but when her shoulder briefly brushed Eliza's, she murmured in a voice barely louder than breath, "Your mother's friend Dinah sent word ahead. We've been waiting for you." Eliza's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She kept her face calm, her steps steady, but inside something that had been clenched tight since the morning the slave traders came for her finally, cautiously began to unclench. She didn't know yet who these people were, or whether they truly could help her use the papers she'd been carrying hidden against her skin for years, the documents her father had signed promising freedom, the scars on her arm that proved those documents were real. But for the first time in months, the future felt like it might contain a door instead of just more walls. The man paid in cash, folded the receipt without looking at it, and turned back to her. "My name is Charles Talbot," he said. "This is Ruth. You'll work in my household. If you're as capable as they claim, you'll be treated fairly. If you cause trouble, you'll be sold before you have time to regret it. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Eliza said, because what else could she say when a stranger had just bought her for more money than most people saw in a lifetime? "Good." He glanced around the yard, where the next auction was already starting. "We go now. Stay close and stay quiet until we're away from here." They left Commerce Street in a tight formation, Talbot in front, Ruth and Eliza just behind, and as the noise and heat of the auction faded, Eliza allowed herself one small dangerous thought. Maybe the most beautiful slave everyone fought to buy had just been purchased by the one man who might actually help her stop being a slave at all. The Talbot house rose out of a side street a few blocks from the river, tall and narrow, built of brick that had darkened with decades of soot and summer storms. It wasn't the sprawling white-columned estate Eliza had grown up imagining when people spoke of rich men's houses. Instead, it looked like the kind of place where money moved on paper, more than it did in bales and barrels. 3 floors stacked neatly above a ground level, with wide front windows and a brass plate that read, "Talbot & Son, Cotton Factors and Commission Agents." Wagons and carriages came and went out front, coughing dust and river mist into the air, while clerks in rolled-up sleeves hurried in and out with ledgers under their arms, never sparing more than a glance for the young woman stepping through the side entrance behind Ruth and the man who'd just bought her. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil, coal smoke, and ink. The back hallway they entered was narrow, lined with peg hooks, heavy with aprons and coats, the floor worn smooth by generations of servants' feet. To one side, a door stood open onto a kitchen, where a large woman with her sleeves rolled past her elbows wielded a spoon like a weapon over a pot that hissed and steamed. To the other, a steep staircase climbed upward into the dimness. Ruth guided Eliza toward the stairs with a slight pressure at her elbow, moving with the practiced assurance of someone who'd traveled this exact route thousands of times. "Up here's where we sleep," Ruth said quietly as they climbed. "Top floor, under the roof. It's hot in summer, cold in winter, and the wind sounds like it wants to be let in, but at least the rain stays out. For most of it." The attic room at the top of the stairs was small but orderly. 3 narrow beds pushed against slanting walls, straw mattresses covered by thin quilts, a single tiny window looking out over the alley. A washstand with a cracked bowl stood in the corner, and a peg rail held a few neatly folded garments that represented the sum total of someone's worldly possessions. Ruth pointed to the bed nearest the window. "That one's yours," she said. "Don't leave things lying around. Mrs. Talbot doesn't like clutter, even when she can't see it. We keep this space clean. It's the only place in the house where we get to decide how things look." Eliza set the small bundle of clothes the trader had allowed her to bring on the bed and sat, feeling the straw give under her weight. The attic was oppressively warm, But after the auction pens and the holding cells and the way the slave trader's eyes had cut through her like knives, the quiet felt almost like relief. She watched Ruth cross to the tiny window, push it open a crack, and stand there for a moment breathing in the humid air like it was fresher than what the house offered. "You're wondering if you landed in a better cage or a worse one," Ruth said without turning around. "Everyone does that first day." "It seems different," Eliza said carefully. "Not better yet, just different." "That's fair." Ruth turned back, and in the thin afternoon light, her face showed the lines that years of managing other people's tempers carved into a person. "Mr. Charles isn't the worst man to belong to, as such things go. He likes order more than he likes pain. He wants the house to run smooth and to be able to tell himself he's a good master. Men like that can be reasoned with sometimes, not because they suddenly think you're equal, because they like thinking well of themselves." Eliza absorbed that, remembering the way Talbot had looked at Henry Ashford at the auction, almost bored, not with the man's panic, but with the predictability of it. A man who'd seen desperate white planters all his life and had grown tired of their excuses. "You said at the mart that my mother's friend sent word," Eliza said. "Dinah. You really knew her?" Ruth's expression softened in a way that made her look suddenly younger. "Knew her? Child, Dinah is the reason I'm not planted under some unmarked rock on a plantation road. She taught me half of what I know, and introduced me to the people who taught me the rest. When she heard Marianne had a girl with papers and a mark, she started watching. Letters travel slow in this world, but they do travel. By the time word came that you'd been moved to a trader's yard, some of us were already waiting to see where you'd land." Eliza's hand went unconsciously to the hem of her dress, fingers pressing where the hidden packet lay sewn in. All those years, the burden of keeping those papers safe had felt like a private secret, a fragile thing that might tear or smudge and vanish into nothing. The idea that other people had known about them, had been quietly looking out for her without her knowledge, made the attic feel suddenly less small. "My mother said not to show them to anyone unless I was sure," she said. "Unless the person had some way to use them. I still don't know if Mr. Talbot is that person." "Neither do I," Ruth said. "But I know this, he has something Marianne and Dinah never had. Access. He sits across tables from judges and lawyers, and they talk freely in front of him, like he's their equal. If we can get him to take your case seriously, he can put those papers in front of the one man in this county who might be persuaded to honor them." "Judge Randall," Eliza said. She'd heard the name in scraps of conversation downstairs already. "The one who likes the law more than he likes people." "That's the one," Ruth said dryly. "A man like that will trample you without blinking if the law gives him permission, but he'll also see to it that the same law bites his own when they get sloppy. Jonathan Pike got sloppy when he signed his name beside that preacher and that clerk. He never thought those words would crawl back out of the dark at him. Our job is to give them legs. Clarissa, Eliza on the paper tag. Clarissa in her own head and in the mouths of the women who'd raised her, took a slow breath. "What do you need me to do?" "For now," Ruth said, "exactly what they brought you here to do. Work, listen, watch. Let Mrs. Talbot see that you're competent and quiet, and make her life easier. Let Mr. Charles discover that you're as good with a pen as you are with a tray. The more useful you are, the harder it'll be for him to shrug and send you away when the time comes to make a choice. And while you're doing that, you keep your ears open. Men talk loose when they think only furniture can hear them. In this house, we are the furniture that remembers." The bell downstairs rang, sharp, demanding, the sound of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ruth stood, smoothing her skirt. "That'll be the mistress," she said. "Come on. Time to meet the woman who runs this place while pretending her son does." Mrs. Talbot was waiting in the front parlor, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, where she could watch the street through a slit in the curtain while maintaining the appearance of genteel disinterest. She was a woman in her late 50s, her hair silvered but still thick, drawn into a knot at the nape of her neck that matched the severity of her dark dress. A Bible rested open on the small table beside her, but her fingers tapped the edge of the pages in a rhythm that suggested her mind was more on the neighbors' carriages than on scripture. "So this is the girl Charles spent a small fortune on," she said, without preamble as Ruth and Eliza entered. Her eyes traveled up and down Eliza's figure with the same cool assessment Covington had used, though the things she was measuring were different. Posture, neatness, the way the dress hung. Turn. Eliza turned slowly, feeling the weight of that pale gaze on the back of her neck, like another pair of hands. "She holds herself well," Mrs. Talbot allowed. "Too well, perhaps. Pretty servants become a nuisance if not managed properly. Men lose their heads, women lose their peace, and the devil laughs. Can you read, girl?" "Yes, ma'am." Eliza said. "Show me." Mrs. Talbot closed the Bible, flipped it open again at random and held it out. Eliza stepped forward, took the heavy book carefully, and read a few verses in a clear, even voice. The older woman watched her mouth more than the words. "Decent," she said when Eliza finished. "Writing?" "I can copy what I'm shown, ma'am," Eliza replied, "and set down what's said. If it's not too fast, we'll see." Mrs. Talbot took the Bible back. "My son has more work than his hands can manage, and his clerk is often unreliable. You may be of use there. In the meantime, your primary duties are to this house. You'll help Ruth keep things in order, attend to my dressing in the mornings and bedtime at night, assist with my granddaughter when needed, and be available when I call. I expect punctuality, cleanliness, and silence unless spoken to. You will not gossip. You will not encourage the attentions of any man under or over this roof. If you prove satisfactory, you will find this a stable household. If you cause trouble, you will find yourself on a trader's wagon heading south before you can unpack your sorrow. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said, her voice as smooth and careful as she could make it. She'd heard versions of this speech before. Every mistress thought she'd invented it. "Good." Mrs. Talbot flicked her fingers toward the door. "Ruth will show you the rest. I do not want to be kept waiting for my tea tomorrow. If you are late, you will regret it." Back in the hallway, Ruth gave a tiny snort. "She likes to bite first and ask questions later," she said. "Don't take it personal. Her bark is half habit, half entertainment for herself. She'll test you for a week, decide you're either reliable or not, then adjust her cruelties accordingly." "What about Mr. Talbot?" Eliza asked. Ruth's mouth tightened in thought. "He'll watch longer and say less. When he does speak to you, listen hard. He gives more away than he means to when he's thinking out loud." Over the next days, the shape of Eliza's new life settled around her, like a garment that didn't quite fit yet, but would, with wear. Mornings began before dawn in the kitchen, where she and Ruth and the cook moved through a choreography of coffee brewing, bread slicing, pan heating, that had to result in hot food on the table at the exact moment Mrs. Talbot descended the stairs. After breakfast, Eliza helped her mistress dress, lacing corsets, fastening buttons, arranging shawls, and then either read aloud from the Bible or the newspaper, while the older woman pretended to focus on the text and actually tracked the movement outside. Midday brought a shifting rotation of tasks, changing linens, polishing silver, minding little Anna in the nursery while Miss Lydia nursed her various vague ailments and her sharper disappointments. It wasn't until the third day that Charles Talbot called for her specifically. Ruth found her polishing banister rails and said, "Mr. Charles wants you in his office. Wash your hands and wipe your face. He doesn't like seeing the work on people who bring him paper." The office on the ground floor was a different world from the upstairs rooms. A world of straight lines and hard angles, shelves jammed with ledgers, a big desk scarred by years of pen scratches and ink spills. Maps of river routes and county lines hung on the walls, their edges curling. Talbot sat behind the desk with his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled, a faint smear of ink on one finger that he seemed unaware of. Papers lay in loose piles around him, the chaos of a methodical man drowning in other people's numbers. "You can read more than scripture, I trust," he said, as Eliza stepped inside. "Yes, sir," she said. "Letters, numbers, simple accounts." He handed her a short letter from a client complaining about freight charges and asked her to copy it into a ledger. She did, her hand steady, the lines straight. When she passed the book back, he examined the page, grunted a small sound of approval, and slid a stack of correspondence toward her. "These need to go into the record," he said. "Date here, sender here, subject here. Don't correct spelling unless it's so bad you can't bear to copy it, and then make a modest improvement. I like to remember exactly how foolish some men look on paper." She worked in silence while he read and responded to other letters, occasionally dictating a line or two for her to write down. The words themselves were the usual mix of commerce and complaint, crop failures, river delays, rumors of bank instability. But Eliza's mind stayed half a step above the page, watching the man across from her. The way he paused before committing to a number, the way his jaw clenched when a correspondent tried to shift blame, the way he sat a little straighter when a letter mentioned Judge Randall, as if even the thought of that man's scrutiny forced him into better posture. Once, when she hesitated over how to spell accommodate, he leaned over, corrected it in a single smooth movement, and then said almost conversationally, "You read faster than most people I've hired to help me." "I had good teachers, sir," she said. "Your previous mistress?" "My mother first," Eliza replied carefully. "Then a preacher who thought knowing letters might help keep souls out of trouble." He huffed a dry, skeptical breath at that. "I've yet to see literacy stop anyone from making bad decisions," he said. "If anything, it gives them more complicated ways to do it, or to catch other people when they do," she said, before she could stop herself. He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "You believe that?" "I've heard it," she amended quickly. "In the quarters, women saying the law is just words, and if they ever got hold of the right ones, they might make them bite the men who wrote them." Something like amusement flickered in his eyes, edged with thoughtfulness. "That's a dangerous thing to say, even in the quarters," he said. "Words have teeth, yes, but they also belong to the men who paid for the paper." "Sometimes," she said softly. "Sometimes they slip." He looked at her a beat longer than politeness required, then went back to his letters, but she could feel the shift, the tiny change in how he saw her, not just as an unusually pretty house servant, but as someone whose mind did not stay politely behind her eyes. That was risky. It was also necessary. If he was ever going to stick his neck out in court on her behalf, he needed to see that she was more than a body he'd paid too much for. Upstairs, Ruth kept her apprised of the world beyond the house. Snippets of news from the courthouse, gossip about Jonathan Pike's new county position, rumors that another mixed-race woman in a neighboring county had quietly been allowed to leave for the north after papers very much like Eliza's were shown to a different judge. Nothing definite, nothing solid enough to bet a life on, but enough to prove that the route her mother had imagined wasn't pure fantasy. At night, in the attic, Eliza lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house cooling, the faint rumble of wagons on distant streets, the sighs of people in other beds. She pressed her fingers against the scars on her left forearm, tracing the faint raised letters that matched the ones on the folded pages upstairs. J.P. Jonathan Pike, a man she'd never met and who probably never spared a thought for the girl whose existence his pen had half acknowledged, but whose signature might, if pushed into the right hands, be her way out of every brick and board and rule in this place. All she needed was one white man willing to believe his own talk about law and honor. Charles Talbot liked to see himself as that kind of man. Ruth was certain of it. The more Eliza watched him, the more she believed it too. The question wasn't whether he wanted to be righteous. The question was whether he wanted it badly enough to pay the price. That answer would come sooner than any of them expected. The moment that forced everything into the open came on a humid afternoon 3 weeks after Eliza arrived, when the house was quieter than usual because Mrs. Talbot and Miss Lydia had gone to visit a sick friend, and little Anna was napping upstairs under Ruth's watchful eye. Eliza was in Talbot's office copying invoices when the front door opened with enough force to rattle the hinges, and a man's voice, sharp, angry, unsteady, cut through the stillness like a blade. "Charles, I know you're here. We need to talk." Talbot set down his pen with the deliberate care of someone preparing for unpleasantness. "That's Henry Ashford," he said quietly, more to himself than to Eliza. "Stay where you are and keep working. Don't react to anything you hear." Before she could respond, the office door swung open and a red-faced man in a rumpled coat stormed in, his cravat askew, and his eyes wild with the particular desperation of someone whose world was collapsing faster than he could shore it up. He barely glanced at Eliza before turning the full weight of his panic on Talbot. "They're taking me to court," he said without preamble. "That bastard lawyer Sawyer filed the petition this morning. He's claiming I signed a binding promise to free a girl, and now he wants Randall to enforce it. You have to help me. You know these people. You know Randall. Tell him it's absurd. Tell him to throw it out." Talbot leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "Sit down, Henry," he said, "and lower your voice. Half the street can hear you." "I don't care who hears me," Ashford snapped, but he dropped into the chair opposite the desk anyway, his hands gripping the armrests like he was trying to keep himself from flying apart. "This is going to ruin me. My wife will find out. My neighbors will find out. Every man I've ever done business with will know I—" He stopped, his jaw working, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "That you fathered a child with an enslaved woman and then put your promise to free her in writing." Talbot finished coldly. "Yes, Henry, that's what they'll know, because you did it." "It was a mistake." Ashford's voice climbed again, cracking at the edges. "I was young, I wasn't thinking clearly, and the girl's mother manipulated me into—" "Don't," Talbot interrupted, his tone flat and hard. "Don't sit in my office and tell me a woman with no power, no rights, and no ability to refuse you manipulated you into anything. You wrote the words, you signed your name. A preacher and a clerk witnessed it. That's not manipulation, that's consequence." Ashford stared at him, mouth open, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You're supposed to be on my side," he said finally, his voice dropping to something raw and wounded. "We're the same kind of men, Charles. We live in the same world. You can't possibly think it's right for me to be dragged through court over something I did years ago when I didn't know better. What I think," Talbot said slowly, each word deliberate, "is that the law exists for a reason, and one of those reasons is to hold men accountable when they make promises they'd rather forget. If you didn't want to be held to your word, you shouldn't have given it in front of witnesses. So you won't help me?" It wasn't a question. Ashford's face had gone from red to pale, his hands trembling slightly where they gripped the chair. "No," Talbot said, "I won't. And if you came here expecting me to lie to Judge Randall on your behalf, you've wasted your time and mine. Get out of my office, Henry, and don't come back unless you're here to settle accounts you actually owe." For a moment, Ashford didn't move, just sat there staring at Talbot with an expression caught between disbelief and rage. Then he surged to his feet, knocking the chair back hard enough that it hit the wall. "You self-righteous bastard," he hissed. "You think you're better than the rest of us because you talk about principles and fairness, but you're just as deep in this system as I am. Deeper, maybe. You make your money off our debts and our cotton and our slaves, and then you sit there in your clean office pretending your hands aren't dirty. One day something's going to come for you, Charles, something you can't talk your way out of, and when it does, I hope you remember this conversation." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough that the maps on the wall shivered. The silence he left behind felt heavier than his shouting had. Talbot sat very still for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his jaw tight and his hands flat on the desk, as if pressing something down. Then he exhaled slowly and turned his attention back to the papers in front of him. Though Eliza could see he wasn't actually reading them, she kept her eyes on her own work, her pen moving across the page in steady strokes. But her mind was racing. Talbot had just thrown a client out of his office for trying to escape a written promise to free someone. He'd called it consequence, accountability, the law doing what it was supposed to do, and he'd done it, even though it cost him money and respect and potentially made him an enemy. That wasn't just talk. That was principle tested and held. If there was ever going to be a moment to show him her papers, this was it, or as close to it as she was likely to get. That night, after the house had gone dark and the only sounds were the distant bark of a dog and the creak of old wood settling, Eliza sat on the edge of her bed in the attic and carefully unpicked the stitches in her dress hem. Ruth sat across from her, a candle stub burning between them, its light throwing their shadows long and strange across the slanted ceiling. Neither of them spoke as Eliza drew out the small oilcloth packet and unfolded it with hands that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to. The 3 pages inside looked fragile in the candlelight. The ink faded in places, the creases deep from years of being folded and refolded, but the words were still there, the signatures were still there, and the promise her father had made, cowardly, inadequate, but legally binding, was still there. "We do it tomorrow," Ruth said quietly, "while Mrs. Talbot is out visiting and before Mr. Charles gets too deep into his day. We catch him when he's calm, when he's had his coffee and his breakfast and hasn't been annoyed by clients yet. We bring these to him. We tell him the truth and we give him the story he needs to believe, that helping you is the right thing, the honorable thing, the thing that proves he's better than men like Henry Ashford." Eliza nodded slowly, her thumb brushing across her father's signature. "And if he says no? If he decides it's too risky or too expensive or just not worth the trouble? Then we move to the next plan," Ruth said, "the one where you disappear in the middle of the night, and I pretend to be as shocked as everyone else. I've got people ready. It won't be comfortable, and it won't be certain, but it's better than waiting around to be sold south." "I don't want to run," Eliza said softly, "not if there's a chance the law can actually do what it's supposed to." "Then we bet on Talbot," Ruth replied. "We bet on his pride and his need to see himself as fair. And we hope that when he reads these pages, he hears his own voice from this afternoon, telling Henry Ashford that promises matter." They sat in silence for a while longer, the candle burning down, the night deepening around them. Somewhere in the house below, Charles Talbot was sleeping, unaware that the girl he'd paid $1,250 for was about to ask him to risk far more than money, unaware that the next day would force him to decide whether his principles were real or just a story. He told himself to feel superior to men whose sins were more visible than his own. If stories where a slave uses a white man's righteousness against him to force the law to bend in her direction, where beauty is strategy and patience is survival, and a father's cowardly signature becomes a weapon his daughter wields in court. Speak to you. If you want to see what happens when Charles Talbot opens those papers and realizes the most expensive purchase he ever made is about to become the most complicated, then like this video right now, Subscribe, so you don't miss the courtroom confrontation that's coming. Comment where in the world you're watching from, because these tactics of using the system's own words against it traveled far beyond Montgomery. And share this, so more people understand that resistance took 1,000 forms, and not all of them involved running in the night. The next morning came bright and clear, the kind of day where heat built slowly from tolerable to suffocating, and people moved through their routines with the resigned efficiency of those who knew there was no escaping it. Eliza woke early, dressed carefully, braided her hair with hands that were steadier than she felt, and tucked the packet of papers into the pocket Ruth had sewn inside her apron the night before. Downstairs, she helped prepare breakfast, served Mrs. Talbot her tea, and waited for the older woman and Miss Lydia to leave for their morning calls. The moment the front door closed behind them, Ruth caught her eye and nodded toward the office. "Now," she said, "before he gets buried in work or someone else comes calling." They found Talbot at his desk, reading a letter with a faint frown of concentration. He glanced up when they entered, surprise flickering across his face at seeing both of them together. "Is something wrong?" he asked, setting the letter aside. "No, sir," Ruth said, "but there's something we need to show you. Something important." He studied them for a moment, then gestured to the chairs. "Sit, both of you, and close the door." Ruth did, the latch clicking with a finality that made Eliza's heart kick harder. She reached into her apron, drew out the packet, and set it on the desk between them. Talbot looked at it, then at her, his expression carefully neutral. "What is this?" he asked. "Papers my mother kept for me," Eliza said, her voice steadier than she'd hoped it would be. "From my father. Jonathan Pike. He signed a promise to free me when I was born, in front of a preacher and a clerk. My mother had me marked to match the documents so they couldn't be separated or denied. I've been carrying them since she died, waiting for someone who could use them. Ruth thought, we thought, you might be that someone." For a long moment Talbot didn't move. Then he reached out, picked up the packet, and unfolded it slowly. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the third. His expression didn't change, but Eliza saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his fingers pressed just slightly harder against the paper, saw the small muscle at the corner of his eye twitch once. When he finally looked up, his gaze moved between her face and the scars on her forearm, visible now where her sleeve had pulled back. "These marks," he said quietly. "J.P. Jonathan Pike." "Yes, sir," she said. "Done when I was small, to prove the papers were real if we were ever separated." He set the documents down carefully, aligning the edges, and leaned back in his chair. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to help me take these to Judge Randall," Eliza said, "to make my father honor what he wrote. Not because you love me or owe me anything, but because yesterday you told Henry Ashford that promises matter, that men who sign their names should be held to their word. I'm asking you to believe that about my father, too." Talbot closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was something raw in his expression. Frustration, maybe, or the weight of a choice he hadn't wanted to face. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I take these papers to Randall and argue that they should be enforced, I will make enemies. Pike will fight. His friends will close ranks around him. Some of my clients will see this as betrayal, as me siding with slaves against white men. It could damage my business, it could damage my reputation, and it might not even work. Randall might read these and decide they're not binding, or he might rule in your favor, and Pike might appeal, dragging this out for years. You could spend the rest of your life in legal limbo, neither slave nor free." "I know," Eliza said, "but staying silent guarantees I stay a slave. Taking the risk at least gives me a chance." He looked at Ruth. "You've been planning this?" "Since the day she arrived," Ruth admitted. "We didn't know if you were the right man, but after yesterday, after what you said to Ashford, we thought maybe you were." Talbot laughed, a short, bitter sound. "So my own principles are the trap you're using against me." "Not against you, sir," Eliza said quietly. "With you. If you help me, you're not the villain in this story. You're the man who proved his word means something, the man who didn't look away when it got inconvenient." He stared at her for a long time, and she held his gaze, refusing to flinch or drop her eyes or make herself smaller. This was the moment. Everything balanced here, her future, her freedom, the question of whether the law could ever be anything more than a weapon aimed at people like her. Finally, Talbot picked up the papers again, folded them carefully, and slipped them into the inner pocket of his coat. "I'll take them to Benjamin Sawyer," he said, "the lawyer handling Ashford's case. If anyone in this town will look at these without immediately dismissing them, it's him. And if he thinks there's a legal argument to be made, I'll go with him to Randall. But understand this, Eliza. Once we start this, There's no taking it back. Pike will know, the court will know, and if we lose, you'll be marked as a troublemaker. I won't be able to protect you from that. I understand, she said. Then we proceed, he said. And God help us all if I'm wrong about this. The weeks that followed moved with the strange double pace of waiting, days that dragged like they were wading through mud, while simultaneously racing towards something unavoidable. Charles Talbot took Eliza's papers to Benjamin Sawyer on a Tuesday morning, returning 3 hours later with a tight expression and ink stains on his cuff that suggested the meeting had involved more writing than talking. He said little about it at first, only that Sawyer had agreed to review the documents and would send word when he had an opinion worth sharing. That word came 4 days later in the form of a short note delivered by a boy who barely waited long enough to be paid before running off again. Talbot read it in his office with Eliza standing across from him. Her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles ached, and when he finished, he set the paper down and met her eyes with something that might have been cautious optimism, or might have been dread wearing a hopeful mask. Sawyer thinks the documents are solid, he said. The signatures are legitimate, the witnesses are credible, and the language, while vague about timing, constitutes a binding promise under Alabama law. He's willing to file a petition for manumission on your behalf, with me listed as the party bringing the case since you can't file in your own name. We'll go before Judge Randall within the month. Eliza felt the floor tilt slightly under her, though she kept her body still. A month. 4 weeks between now and the moment when a white man in a robe would decide whether she stayed property or became something the law acknowledged as a person. It felt impossibly close and unbearably far away at the same time. What happens if we win? She asked, because she needed to know the shape of the best outcome even if it felt dangerous to hope for it. If we win, Randall will issue a decree of manumission, ordering Pike to honor his promise and release you from bondage. Technically, you'd still belong to me until the paperwork cleared, but at that point I'd be required by court order to let you go. You'd be free, or as free as any person of color can be in Alabama, which is to say you'd need papers proving your status, and you'd need to be careful where you went and who you trusted, but you wouldn't be anyone's property anymore. And if we lose? His jaw tightened. If we lose, you remain mine. Pike will likely be angry enough to make trouble, and some of that trouble might spill onto you. I'd do what I could to shield you, but my options would be limited, and there's a third possibility worse than losing. What's that? That Randall rules in our favor, but Pike appeals to a higher court and drags this out for years. You'd be in legal limbo, still enslaved on paper, but with a case pending that might eventually free you. Some masters would sell you off fast to avoid the headache. I wouldn't, but you'd be stuck waiting, and waiting in this situation is its own kind of prison. Eliza absorbed that, turning it over in her mind. Even the best outcome came wrapped in complications and dangers she'd have to navigate alone. But it was still better than the certainty of remaining a slave until she died, or someone decided she was worth less alive than sold. I want to go forward, she said. I thought you might, Talbot replied, and something in his tone suggested he'd expected nothing less. Then we prepare. Sawyer will file the petition this week. Pike will be notified. He'll have time to respond, to hire his own lawyer, to build whatever defense he thinks will save him from embarrassment. And then we'll all stand in front of Randall and see whether the law bends toward justice or convenience. The news that Charles Talbot was suing Jonathan Pike on behalf of a slave girl spread through Montgomery's white sheehoy like fire through dry grass, and the reactions ranged from baffled amusement to outright hostility. Some of Talbot's clients quietly withdrew their business, sending curt notes explaining that they preferred to work with men who understood the natural order of things. Others came to his office specifically to argue with him, to ask what he thought he was doing, risking his reputation over a girl who'd probably been lying about the whole thing anyway. A few, a very few, expressed quiet support, though always in private and never in writing. The general consensus among the men who mattered in Montgomery seemed to be that Talbot had lost his mind, and the women whispered that it must be because he'd become infatuated with the girl, because what other explanation could there be for a sensible businessman throwing his standing away over a slave's claim? Inside the Talbot house, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Talbot had taken to addressing Eliza in clipped, icy tones when she addressed her at all, as if the girl was somehow personally responsible for her son's sudden inconvenient attack of principles. Miss Lydia avoided Eliza entirely, afraid, perhaps, that whatever madness had infected her brother might be contagious. Only little Anna seemed oblivious, still trailing after Eliza with questions and demands for stories, a small bright spot in days that otherwise felt like walking through a minefield. Ruth kept her ear to the ground, collecting information from the network of black domestics and free workers who moved invisibly through white Montgomery. She learned that Pike had hired a lawyer named Thaddeus Grimm, a man known for his skill at making juries forget inconvenient facts and judges doubt their own sense. She learned that Pike's wife had taken to her bed with nerves and that his neighbors were closing ranks around him, circulating a petition claiming the whole case was an abolitionist conspiracy designed to destabilize the institution of slavery from within. She learned that Judge Randall had reportedly said, in a private conversation overheard by a clerk, that he wished both parties would settle the matter out of court because he had better things to do than referee white men's guilty consciences. All of this Ruth passed on to Eliza in fragments during stolen moments in the attic or the linen closet, building a picture of the battlefield they'd soon have to cross. And through it all, Eliza kept working, serving tea, copying letters, reading to Mrs. Talbot from the Bible in a voice that gave away nothing of the storm raging in her chest, because the one thing she couldn't afford was to give anyone an excuse to say she'd become difficult or unreliable or anything that would justify selling her away before the case could be heard. The night before the hearing, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay on her narrow bed listening to Ruth's steady breathing across the room and the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls, a dog barking, a wagon's wheels on cobblestones, someone singing a hymn off-key, and tried to imagine what the courtroom would look like, what words would be said, how it would feel to stand there while men argued over whether her father's signature meant anything. She tried to imagine freedom, what it would be like to walk through a door and know she didn't have to come back unless she chose to. But the image kept slipping away from her, too big and strange to hold on to. What she could imagine, vividly, and with an ache that pressed against her ribs, was her mother's face. Marianne had never lived to see this moment, had died still enslaved and hoping, but she'd prepared for it anyway. She'd taught Eliza to read, so the words on the page wouldn't be weapons only white people could wield. She'd had her marked with her father's initials, so the connection couldn't be denied. She'd kept those papers safe through moves and sales, and the constant threat of discovery, folding them smaller and smaller until they were almost nothing. A fragile thread of hope passed from mother to daughter, with the warning that it might break, but that it was still worth holding. And now, tomorrow, in a wood-paneled room that smelled of old tobacco and older power, that thread would be pulled taut. It would either hold or it would snap. There was no middle ground left. Morning came too fast and too slow. Eliza dressed in the best clothes she owned, a simple dark dress that Ruth had altered to fit properly, a clean white collar, her hair braided and pinned with a care that felt like armor. She ate nothing because her stomach wouldn't accept food, and she avoided looking at Mrs. Talbot during the tense, silent breakfast, because she couldn't afford to flinch if the older woman's glare found her. When the courthouse clock struck 9, Talbot appeared in the front hall in his best coat, his face set in grim lines, and said simply, "It's time." The courthouse sat at the center of Montgomery like a rot, holding everything around it in orbit, a red brick building with white columns and a bell tower that looked noble from a distance and oppressive up close. The courtroom itself was on the second floor, a long, narrow space with high windows that let in light but not air, rows of wooden benches facing a raised platform where Judge Randall presided like a figure from an Old Testament engraving. The room was already half full when they arrived, planters and merchants who'd come to watch the spectacle, a few lawyers with no stake in the case but plenty of opinions, and a small group of black faces in the back corner who sat in careful silence, bearing witness. Eliza sat where Sawyer directed her, on a bench behind the table where he and Talbot would argue. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her gaze forward, aware of every pair of eyes that turned her way, every whisper that cut through the room's low buzz. Across the aisle, Jonathan Pike sat beside his lawyer Grimm, a man in his 40s with thinning hair and a soft belly that his expensive vest couldn't quite hide. Pike himself was younger than Eliza had imagined, maybe 50, with a face that might have been handsome once, but had settled into the slack lines of someone who'd spent years getting what he wanted without question. He didn't look at her, not once, as if by refusing to meet her eyes he could deny she was anything more than an unfortunate misunderstanding, someone had blown out of proportion. Judge Randall entered at exactly 10 o'clock, a tall man with white hair and a lean face that gave away nothing. Everyone stood. He sat. The clerk called the case. And just like that, the moment Eliza had been carrying toward since her mother first pressed those papers into her hands was here, real and irreversible. Sawyer stood and spoke first, his voice clear and steady, laying out the facts with the precision of someone who knew that emotion would be dismissed, but evidence might land. He described the documents: Pike's signed promise, the preacher's witness, the clerk's corroboration. He described the mark on Eliza's arm that matched the written record. He argued that under Alabama law, a promise made in writing and properly witnessed created a binding obligation, and that Pike's failure to honor that promise was not just morally wrong but legally actionable. He spoke about precedent, about other cases where manumission promises had been upheld, about the principle that a man's word once given should not be discarded simply because honoring it had become inconvenient. When he finished, Grimm stood and spent the next 20 minutes trying to dismantle everything Sawyer had built. He argued that the promise was vague, conditional, never meant to create immediate obligation. He suggested that Eliza's mother had coerced Pike into signing under duress, though he offered no evidence for that claim. He painted Pike as a young man who'd made a mistake in a moment of weakness and didn't deserve to be punished for it decades later. He hinted, without quite saying it directly, that the whole case was part of a larger abolitionist plot, that allowing it to succeed would open floodgates, that every slave in Alabama with a scrap of paper would suddenly claim freedom and the entire social order would collapse. Eliza sat through it all, her face still, her hands steady, even as her heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to stand up and scream that she wasn't a plot or a symbol or an inconvenience. She was a person whose father had acknowledged her existence just enough to ease his conscience, but not enough to actually change her life. And now she was asking the law to make him finish what he started. But she couldn't speak. She had no voice in this room. Her fate rested in the hands of men who would decide her future, while barely acknowledging she was there. Finally, after both sides had spoken and Judge Randall had asked a series of dry, technical questions that revealed nothing of his own opinion, he announced that he would take the matter under advisement and issue his ruling within the week. The gavel fell, the room exhaled, and Eliza stood on shaking legs, still enslaved, still waiting, but closer to an answer than she'd ever been. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright and the air too thick. Talbot walked beside her in silence, his face unreadable, and Ruth met them at the courthouse steps with a look that asked 100 questions she didn't voice. They went home, they waited. And the days that followed were some of the longest Eliza had ever lived. The ruling came on a Thursday morning exactly 6 days after the hearing, delivered not in open court, but in a written decision that Judge Randall's clerk hand-carried to Benjamin Sawyer's office, and that Sawyer then brought immediately to the Talbot house, his face carefully neutral, in a way that made it impossible to tell whether he was carrying good news or the end of everything. Eliza was upstairs changing linens when Ruth found her and said, voice tight, "Mr. Sawyer's here. Mr. Charles wants you in the office." Now, the walk down the stairs felt longer than any distance Eliza had ever crossed. Her legs moved, her hand touched the banister, her feet found each step, but her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere far away where consequences couldn't reach her yet. By the time she reached the office door, she'd already imagined both futures so many times they'd worn grooves in her thoughts, the one where she walked out free, and the one where she stayed shackled to someone else's legal property list until she died or was sold or simply stopped hoping. She stepped inside. Talbot and Sawyer stood on opposite sides of the desk, the written decision lying flat between them like a knife that hadn't decided yet which direction to cut. Sawyer looked up when she entered, and for one unbearable second his face gave away nothing. Then slowly something softened in his expression, not quite a smile, but the kind of easing that comes when tension finally finds permission to unclench. "Judge Randall has ruled in your favor," he said, and the words hit Eliza like a fist and a caress at the same time, knocking the air out of her lungs, while simultaneously filling her with something too large to name. "He's issued a decree of manumission ordering Jonathan Pike to honor the promise made in writing before witnesses. The court finds the document legally binding and enforceable. You are to be freed within 30 days, pending completion of the necessary paperwork." For a moment, Eliza couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there while the words rearranged everything she'd ever understood about what was possible. Free. The law had said free. A white man in a position of power had read her father's cowardly half-promise and decided it meant something, that it created an obligation that couldn't be waved away just because honoring it was inconvenient or embarrassing or socially awkward. The thing her mother had died hoping for, the thing Dinah and Ruth and all the women whose names she'd never know had worked toward in whispers and hidden actions, had just been granted by a system designed to deny it. "What about Pike?" she heard herself ask. her voice sounding strange and distant. "Can he appeal?" "He can try," Sawyer said, "and he probably will. But Randall's ruling is thorough and well-reasoned. An appeals court would have to find significant legal error to overturn it, and I don't believe they will." Pike's lawyer argued emotion and fear. We argued law, and today, the law won. Talbot, who had been standing very still throughout this exchange, finally moved. He picked up the decision, scanned it once more as if confirming the words hadn't changed, then set it down and looked at Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You'll stay in this house until the paperwork clears," he said. "Not because you're still my property. Legally you are. But practically speaking, that distinction is now just a formality, but because you'll need time to prepare. Freedom isn't simple, especially for someone in your position. You'll need papers proving your status. You'll need money, which I'll provide as a settlement for the work you've done. You'll need to decide where you'll go, because staying in Montgomery may not be safe once Pike's friends realize you won." Eliza nodded slowly, trying to absorb the practicalities through the overwhelming rush of emotion. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for taking the risk, for not turning away when it would have been easier." Talbot's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I didn't do it to be thanked," he said. "I did it because you were right. Promises should matter, even the ones we'd rather forget." Over the next weeks, the shape of Eliza's new life began to take form in fragments and small revolutions. The legal paperwork moved through the system with the grinding slowness of bureaucracy that resented being forced to acknowledge exceptions to its own rules. But it moved. Pike filed an appeal, exactly as Sawyer had predicted, but the higher court declined to hear it on the grounds that Randall's decision was sound and the evidence overwhelming. The news sent shockwaves through Montgomery's planter class, not because one mixed-race woman's freedom materially changed anything about the system they'd built, but because it suggested that the system had cracks, that a man's written word could be turned into a lever, even against his own interests. And that scared them more than any midnight escape ever could. Inside the Talbot house, the atmosphere shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Mrs. Talbot stopped giving Eliza orders and started directing her requests through Ruth instead, as if acknowledging the girl directly would somehow validate what had happened. Miss Lydia began looking at her with something like nervous curiosity, as if Eliza had transformed into a creature from a storybook whose rules didn't apply to normal people. Only Anna seemed unchanged, still demanding stories and trailing after Eliza with the unconscious cruelty of a child who didn't yet understand that some people weren't allowed to leave, even when they desperately wanted to. Ruth, for her part, moved through those weeks with a kind of quiet satisfaction that she tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. "Your mother would be proud," she said one night in the attic, the two of them sitting together in the darkness, with the window open to let in what little breeze the summer night offered. "Marianne spent her whole life teaching you to survive and to fight, and you did both. You took the thing they said you couldn't have, and you made them give it to you using their own rules. That's not just freedom, that's victory." "It doesn't feel like victory yet," Eliza admitted. "It feels like standing at the edge of something so big I can't see across it." "That's because it is big," Ruth said. "Freedom always is, especially when you've never had it before. You'll stumble, you'll make mistakes. You'll have days where you wonder if the cage was simpler, because at least you knew its shape. But you'll also have days where you wake up and remember that nobody owns you anymore, and on those days everything else will feel worth it." The morning Eliza finally walked out the front door of the Talbot house as a free woman, the sky was pale and clean, washed by the night's rain into a color that didn't quite have a name. She carried a small bag containing the few possessions she'd accumulated, a change of clothes, the papers proving her manumission, a letter of reference Talbot had written in his careful script, and $40 in coins that represented more money than she'd ever held in her life. Ruth walked her to the corner where a carriage waited to take her to the docks, where a riverboat would carry her north toward Tennessee, and from there toward places where free black people could build lives that weren't constantly shadowed by the threat of re-enslavement. "You'll write when you can," Ruth said. Not a question, but a command disguised as hope. "I will," Eliza promised. "And when I'm settled, when I've found work and a place that feels even a little bit like safety, I'll send for you, or I'll come back. One way or another, this isn't goodbye forever." Ruth pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace that smelled of lye soap and lavender and all the years they'd spent building trust in whispers. "Go," she said, stepping back, "before I start crying and embarrass us both." Eliza climbed into the carriage. The driver clicked his tongue and the horse moved forward. And just like that, The Talbot House and Commerce Street and the courthouse where a judge had said words that mattered began to slide away behind her. She pressed her hand against the scar on her forearm, feeling the raised letters. J.P. Jonathan Pike, the man who'd acknowledged her just enough to ease his guilt, but not enough to actually help her, whose cowardice had paradoxically given her the one weapon that could free her. She wondered if he knew yet that the appeal had failed, if he was sitting in his house stewing over the humiliation, or if he'd already begun the process of forgetting she existed. It didn't matter. His name was on her skin and on the legal document in her bag, but he no longer had any power over her life. That, more than anything, was what freedom meant. The riverboat was crowded and loud, full of traders and travelers and families relocating north, where land was cheaper and opportunities, allegedly, more abundant. Eliza found a spot on the deck near the railing where she could watch Montgomery shrink behind her, the city's brick and wooden buildings compressing into a smudge of color against the red clay and green trees. Somewhere in that smudge was the auction platform where she'd been sold like furniture. Somewhere was the courthouse, where men had argued over whether her father's signature meant anything. Somewhere were the women who taught her mother and Ruth and countless others how to carry hope, folded so small it could hide in a hem or behind a smile or under a scar. If you followed Eliza's story from the auction block to the courtroom, from being the slave everyone fought to own to the woman who used their own laws to walk away free, and if stories like this remind you that resistance took 1,000 forms, and not all of them made it into the history books that only celebrated violent rebellion, then like this video right now, because these histories deserve to be remembered as vividly as any battlefield. Subscribe, so you never miss another story about the people who fought with patience and paperwork, and the quiet refusal to accept what they were told was inevitable. Comment where in the world you're watching from, because these tactics of turning the system against itself traveled far beyond Alabama, and the lessons still matter. And share this so the algorithm doesn't bury the kind of history that makes people uncomfortable, but that everyone needs to hear. Eliza didn't know what waited for her in Tennessee or beyond. She didn't know if she'd find work easily or struggle for months. She didn't know if the freedom papers in her bag would be respected or challenged, if she'd have to fight the same battles over and over, or if this victory would hold. What she did know was that she was standing on a riverboat with nothing and no one forcing her to stay, with money in her pocket that was hers, and papers that said her body belonged to her and not to some ledger in a factor's office. She knew that her mother's hope hadn't been wasted. She knew that somewhere behind her, other women were watching what had happened to her and learning, adding it to the collective store of knowledge about what was possible when you were patient enough and smart enough and lucky enough to turn a master's weapon against him. The river current caught the boat and pulled it north, away from Montgomery and the past and the life she'd never asked for, but had survived anyway. Eliza gripped the railing and watched the water churn, brown and fast and relentless, carrying her towards something she couldn't see yet, but could finally, for the first time in her life, choose. Years later, people would tell different versions of what happened to the most beautiful slave that everyone fought to buy in Alabama in 1854. Some said she disappeared into the north and was never heard from again. Others claimed she'd been re-enslaved by bounty hunters who didn't care about legal papers. A few, the ones who knew better or who'd received letters that arrived folded in other people's luggage, whispered that she'd made it to a free state, found work as a teacher, married a man who'd also bought his freedom, and raised children who grew up never knowing what it felt like to be property. Which version was true didn't matter as much as the fact that the story itself traveled, passed from quarters to churches, to the invisible networks of people who needed to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the system could be made to bend. The documents Eliza had carried, the papers Jonathan Pike signed in a moment of weakness and regretted for the rest of his life, became a kind of template. Other enslaved people heard about them and started asking the white men who'd fathered them for similar promises, not because they expected those men to honor them voluntarily, but because they understood that written words, once witnessed, became harder to deny. Lawyers like Benjamin Sawyer, who'd taken her case when others wouldn't, found themselves approached by more clients carrying folded papers and faint hope, and while not all of those cases succeeded, enough of them did that the tactic became part of the arsenal of resistance that enslaved people used alongside escape, sabotage, and the 1,000 other ways they fought back. And in Montgomery, in a tall brick house on a tree-lined street, Charles Talbot continued his work as a cotton factor and commission agent, still making money off the system he'd lived in all his life. But every now and then, when a client came to him trying to weasel out of a debt or a promise, he'd think about the girl whose freedom had cost him reputation and clients, and the approval of men whose respect he'd once craved. He'd think about how she'd stood in his office and asked him to be the man he claimed he was. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he'd refuse to help the man in front of him escape his obligations. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't even close, but it was a reminder that even in systems built on cruelty, individuals still made choices, and those choices still mattered. The river carried Eliza north, away from Alabama, and into a future she'd build one careful step at a time. Behind her, the auction platform stood empty, waiting for the next day's sales. The courthouse doors opened and closed on cases that would shape other lives, and somewhere in an attic room, another young woman was learning to read by candlelight, while her mother whispered about papers and promises and the long, patient work of turning beauty into strategy and bondage into a fight that could sometimes be won.